Welcome back to part 3 of our lectures on race in North America. In part 2, we talked a lot about how race is a very loaded term, packed with significant meaning, especially in terms of how it gets socially constructed. In that part of the lecture, we spoke primarily of how 4 groups in particular have been constructed and are present on the continent: whites, or those of European descent; blacks, or those of African descent; indigenous peoples, and Asians. There's something of a 5th group that we also need to consider: North Americans who are of mixed race. 1 in 4 North Americans is mixed race, so they are actually the largest racial minority. As we saw in part 2, there are differences in how we understand race in the various parts of North America. Being mixed race has particular significance in Mexico, where, in fact, people of mixed European and indigenous backgrounds are the majority. So we begin our lecture, this time, in Mexico. In the southern end of our continent, the mixing of races can be traced back to the conquest. There were so few Spanish women here that sexual relationships between Spanish men and indigenous women were perhaps inevitable. In the very earliest period, before the number of Spanish women began to catch up with Spanish men, the children born from mixed-race unions were often accepted on relatively equal terms in New Spain, at least those who were born to couples in a legitimate, in other words, married, relationship. The term mestizo, that is very commonly used in Mexico today to refer to people of European indigenous mixed race, was used during the colonial period of New Spain as something of a nasty word to refer to mixed-race individuals born to parents not in a proper marriage. By the early 20th century, the word came to be used more popularly, without this more negative connotation or meaning attached to it. Remember that I had said in the last lecture that what we mean by race can be perceived differently in cultural terms, as the idea gets constructed by people in a given society. So it's quite interesting to see how, over time, the idea of racial mixing, or mestizaje, as is said in Mexico, is understood. In the 1800s, it was not uncommon for Mexican intellectuals to consider mestizaje to be a good thing, because it would ultimately lead to the full assimilation of the indigenous peoples. In effect, nationalist and racist ideas merged. Divisions between whites and indigenous were seen as a problem because they would prevent the development of a single united Mexican identity. What was needed was a truly hybrid racial identity, created by encouraging large-scale immigration by Europeans. In effect, the indigenous blood would ultimately become so diluted that the mixed race would really just be temporary until everyone was white. Throughout the 20th century, Mexicans continued to rethink how national identity was connected to mestizaje. By the 1920s, fully 60% of Mexicans were identifying themselves as mestizo, so it's perhaps not surprising that there was less talk of mestizaje as a method to whiten the country and to deal with indigenous peoples. This rethinking also took place in the social upheaval and aftermath of the Mexican Revolution or Civil War that took place from 1910 to 1920. In this era, mestizaje came to be seen as a potential source of national strength and pride. Of particular importance in promoting this idea was writer and philosopher José Vasconcelos. His essay, The Cosmic Race, became famous. In it, he argued that the Americas were destined to be the place where all races from around the world would ultimately fuse together. Vasconcelos was highly critical of the Anglo-Saxons to the north, who he saw as reactionaries against this inevitable trend, focused as they were on preserving the purity of their particular white race. Today, mestizaje is very much seen as a trait by which Mexico and Mexicans identify themselves. That said, it's not always universally seen as a good thing, the way Vasconcelos had framed it. Another great Mexican intellectual, Octavio Paz, has said that at the very heart of the Mexican national character, there is a deep-seated conflict because of mestizaje. Think about it. The original mixed-race Mexicans were the result of Spanish conquerors raping indigenous women, an inherently violent act. What does it mean, then, to be nationally rooted in this way? Remember from our first week the work you did on La Malinche. Remember her appearance just over the shoulder of Hernan Cortés. Their son, Martin Cortés, is widely seen as the original mestizo. Now, according to this interpretation, Cortés represents masculinity, strength, and violent imposition. La Malinche, though, is seen as both a victim and a betrayer. She did, after all, help the Spanish. What does this mean for the identities of all their descendants who have inherited this internal conflict? Of course, this interpretation has been challenged by many scholars. Is it too simplistic? Academics do what we do best, argue. The point can be made, though, that this view seems to have penetrated into the Mexican psyche and might help to explain common stereotypes that exist. Mexican men who have macho exteriors, hiding inferiority complexes, and the idea of long-suffering Mexican women. They are just stereotypes in Mexico, and yet they are so widely accepted that they have come to be seen as true, whether they are or not. The idea of mestizaje is clearly an important part of Mexican national identity. Colonial encounters also led to the mixing of races in Canada, though not nearly on the scale and to the degree seen in Mexico. In the Canadian experience, the Métis, largely the descendants of relationships between French fur traders and indigenous women, are quite similar to the early mestizo in New Spain. The key difference is demographic. British and French colonizers managed to gain numerical superiority over the indigenous peoples of Canada. As a consequence, the Métis were marginalized and experienced racism to a much greater degree. The Europeans in the Canadian context were ultimately able to develop a sufficient or critical mass of settlers of both genders that then made it possible to maintain a more separate racial identity as white. Still, the Métis have demonstrated, today and in the past, a noted degree of self-identification as a distinct racial and cultural group. In the late 19th century, they even militarily resisted the attempts of the newly created Canadian nation-state to impose its control over territory in the West. Their efforts in 1869 compelled the federal government to negotiate, leading to the creation of Manitoba as a province and the setting aside of lands for the Métis. Later acts of resistance in the 1880s proved less successful. Louis Riel, the Métis leader who had also led their efforts in the 1860s, once again rallied a military force. This time, the Métis could not repel Canadian soldiers, and the Northwest Mounted Police sent to end what the government saw as open rebellion. Riel was caught, tried, and executed. In Canada today, about 500,000 people, or 1.4% of the Canadian population, identify as Métis. It's certainly not an insignificant number, but it does stand in stark relative contrast to the place of mestizo in Mexico. To end this part of the lecture, we turn to mid-continent and the United States. The key mixed-race group to address here are biracial blacks and whites. The history of this group begins as early as the 17th century, most likely with the children born to black slaves and white indentured servants. Very quickly, relationships between white slave owners and slaves then also explain the emergence of mixed-race individuals in colonial America. On plantation households, there was an assumption that the owner and the sons had, as a right of property, sexual access to slaves. In the Caribbean colonies of Britain, Spain, and France, it was not uncommon for slave owners to engage in mixed-race relations with their slaves. In fact, it became an accepted practice in society, with plantation owners recognizing their children, freeing them, and providing them with education. The situation was different in the American South. Here, sexual relations between plantation owners and slaves were frowned upon, even as it happened all the time. There was no culture here of plantation owners accepting responsibility for the children born from these encounters. There were occasions when owners would free their children, but this was exceptional. The majority remained slaves. The identities of mixed black and white Americans were quite fluid throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. In some states, such as South Carolina, mixed-race individuals occupied a distinct and accepted status between whites and blacks. But the American Civil War and the end of slavery served to fuse identities between black and mixed-race Americans. In reaction to the racist attitudes of whites, people of mixed race engaged actively in supporting recently freed slaves. Then, as segregation legislation took hold in the South, it seemed as though people were increasingly defined as either black or white. In the southern states, people were defined as black if they had any African blood. This came to be known as the one-drop rule. There was no room here for mixed race identities. Today in the United States, it's thought that between 75 and 90% of African Americans are mixed-race persons of European and African descent. We began this series of lectures with the story of Martin Luther King Jr. It might be worth noting at this point that he too had European ancestors, Irish specifically, on his father's side. What mixed race means depends very much upon where you find yourself in North America. It's clear, though, that in all three countries, mestizaje, as the Mexicans would say, has been a factor that has shaped national, subnational, cultural, and racial identities. In the last part of our lecture series, we'll end with a particular case study of Black identity across the Canadian and American border. We'll see you next time.